Rain had been threatening Chicago all morning, hanging low and grey over the city like a held breath, the kind of sky that warns you something is coming, but never tells you what. Cara Mitchell didn't have time to look up at the sky. She was too busy counting. She stood in the middle of aisle 7 at Greenfield's Grocery, a mid-sized store on the edge of the Wicker Park neighborhood, and she counted the coins in her palm the way someone counts seconds before a crash, slowly, carefully, dreading the final number. A quarter, 2 dimes, 4 pennies, a nickel that had been sitting at the bottom of her coat pocket so long it had turned slightly green. She counted again as if the numbers might rearrange themselves into something more generous. They didn't. $1.29. Her eyes moved up to the yellow price tag on the shelf in front of her. Greenfield's brand baby diapers, size 2, $14. 99. She almost laughed. Almost. Cara was 27 years old, with dark blonde hair pulled into a ponytail that hadn't been properly brushed since Tuesday, wearing a beige sweater that had a small mustard stain near the left cuff she'd stopped trying to scrub out weeks ago. She had hazel eyes that, on better days, had a warmth to them that made strangers feel instantly at ease. Today those eyes were red at the corners, carrying the particular exhaustion that doesn't come from one bad night, but from months of them stacked end to end. She had $12 in her checking account. She knew that because she'd checked her banking app 4 times that morning, each time hoping the number had somehow changed. It hadn't, and the rent auto payment was scheduled for the 15th, which was in 3 days, and the rent was $840, and the math of her life had stopped making sense sometime around March, when her hours at the restaurant were cut in half after the new manager decided he could run a Friday night service with a skeleton crew. In the stroller beside her, 8-month-old Noah slept with his mouth slightly open, one tiny fist curled under his chin. He had Cara's nose and his father's eyelashes, long and dark and criminally unfair on a baby, and he smelled like warm laundry and something inexplicably sweet, the way babies do, as if the world hasn't gotten to them yet. The world was very much getting to Cara. She picked up the store brand package, turned it over, set it back down. Picked up the next size, same price. Checked the count inside each one. Did the mental arithmetic of how many days a package might last. If she was careful, if she stretched it, if she... She stopped that line of thinking because it led somewhere she didn't want to go. A mother shouldn't have to ration her baby's diapers. She knew that. Knowing it and being able to change it were 2 entirely different things. She had already put back the orange juice, the loaf of whole-grain bread she'd reached for out of habit, and a small container of yogurt. What remained in her basket was a can of black beans, a box of store-brand pasta, and a single banana that was maybe 1 day away from being too ripe. Practical, efficient, joyless. She pulled out her phone and opened the banking app one more time. $12.04. The 4 cents felt like a personal insult. "Excuse me." The voice came from behind her, deep even, carrying the kind of quiet authority that doesn't need to raise itself to be heard. Cara turned. The man standing in the aisle was tall, well over 6 feet, with dark hair slightly disheveled, in a way that looked accidental but somehow worked entirely in his favor. He had a close-trimmed beard and sharp jaw, and he was wearing a dark navy suit jacket over a white shirt, the top 2 buttons open. On his wrist was a watch that Cara didn't know enough about watches to identify, but something about the way it caught the store's overhead light suggested it cost more than her car. He was holding a single item, a bottle of sparkling water, as though he'd wandered into the grocery store the same way someone wanders into a room and forgets why. He was looking at the diaper shelf behind her. "Sorry," Cara said, stepping aside automatically, assuming he needed to pass. "No, He paused. Something flickered across his face. Not discomfort exactly. More like someone recalibrating. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "You're not interrupting anything." She gave a small, flat smile. "Just doing math." He glanced at the package in her hand, then at the coin still visible in her loosely closed fist, then back at her face. He was not subtle about it, but somehow it didn't feel rude. It felt more like the gaze of someone who paid attention to things most people had trained themselves to look past. "What size does your baby take?" he asked. Cara blinked. Sorry? The diapers. What size? She stared at him for a moment. He had the kind of face that was difficult to read, not cold but contained, like someone who had learned a long time ago to keep the surface still, whatever was happening underneath. Size 2, she said carefully. Why? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached past her, close enough that she caught a faint trace of cedar and something clean, like cold air, and picked up one of the packages. He turned it over briefly, the same way she had, then set it back. Then he picked up the larger economy pack, the one with 48 diapers, the one priced at $26 that Cara had already looked at and looked away from. These are better value, Tup, he said almost to himself. I know, she said. I did the math. He looked at her again, and this time, whatever had been flickering behind his expression settled into something more definite, though she still couldn't quite name it. I'm going to buy them, he said, all of them. Cara laughed, an actual laugh, short and involuntary. I'm sorry? The diapers. All the size 2 packages on this shelf. I'd like to buy them. He held her gaze without flinching. And I'd like you to take them. The aisle felt suddenly very quiet. Somewhere behind them, a child was asking its mother for cereal. A stock boy was moving a cart somewhere near the produce section. Normal grocery store sounds carrying on as if the air in aisle 7 hadn't just shifted completely. Cara looked at the man, then at the shelf. There were 6 packages of size 2 diapers, the store brand, the name brand, the economy pack, 2 mid-size options. I don't know you, she said. No, he agreed. You don't. So why would you? Because I can, he said. And then quieter. And because I'd like to. Noah stirred in the stroller, making a small sound, and both of them looked at him at the same moment. The baby with his fist still curled under his chin, blinking slowly at the ceiling lights as though they were mildly interesting. He made another soft sound somewhere between a sigh and a question and settled back into sleep. Cara looked back at the man. Something in her wanted to say no. That fierce, bruised pride that had been the only consistent thing in her life for the past 8 months. The part of her that had refused every offer of help from her mother, from her friends, from the social worker who had handed her a pamphlet at the pediatrician's office. That part rose up immediately, automatic and defensive. But she looked at the coins in her hand. $1.29. And she looked at Noah. I don't even know your name, she said. He seemed to consider whether that was a problem. Then he held out his hand. Elliot, he said. Elliot Hargrove. She shook it. His grip was warm and firm. Cara Mitchell. A pause stretched between them, not uncomfortable exactly, more like a held breath. Let me buy the diapers, Cara, he said. She opened her mouth, closed it, looked at Noah one more time. And then she said something she hadn't said to anyone in 8 months. Okay. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known standing in aisle 7 with her coins and her pasta and her sleeping baby, was that Elliot Hargrove's name appeared on the Forbes list every year, that the building she could see from the store's front window, the glass tower on Michigan Avenue, had his company's name etched into the lobby floor, that he had not set foot inside a grocery store in over 4 years, and that he had no idea, not yet, why he had walked into this one today. Elliot Hargrove had not planned to be in Greenfield's grocery that Tuesday morning. That was the truth, and it was the kind of truth that felt strange to him afterward. The idea that something significant could begin so accidentally, so without intention or design. He had been walking, that was all. Walking, which was itself unusual for him, because Elliot was a man whose movements were typically scheduled, coordinated and purposeful. His days ran on a structure that his assistant, Margaret, built with surgical precision, meetings stacked from 8 in the morning through 6 in the evening, calls slotted into the gaps, dinners with investors or board members filling whatever remained. His life was, by any external measure, a masterpiece of efficiency. It was also, by any honest internal measure, almost completely empty. He had left his office on the 43rd floor of Hargrove Tower at 10:17 that morning after cancelling a 10 o'clock meeting with his legal team, something he never did, because he had sat down at the conference table, looked around at the 7 people waiting for him with their folders and their laptops and their rehearsed talking points, and felt something close to suffocation. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind. The kind that creeps in slowly and then one morning is simply there, sitting on your chest while you try to breathe normally. He had told Margaret he needed an hour. She had looked at him with the particular expression she reserved for situations outside her established protocols, slightly alarmed, carefully neutral, and nodded without asking questions. Margaret was excellent at not asking questions. He had walked south on Michigan Avenue with no destination in mind, hands in his jacket pockets, moving through the late morning crowd the way wealthy men in expensive suits often do, noticed but not approached. A woman had recognized him near the corner of Erie Street and looked away quickly, the way people do when they're deciding whether acknowledging someone is worth the awkwardness. He had kept walking. He had passed Greenfield's grocery because it was there. He had gone inside because, and this was the part he would have difficulty explaining later, to himself and to others, because the smell hit him when the automatic doors opened. Coffee and bread and produce and something warm and ordinary. He hadn't smelled anything ordinary in a very long time, so he had grabbed a basket, walked the aisles with no list and no plan, and ended up in aisle 7 with a bottle of sparkling water, watching a woman in a beige sweater count coins in her palm, like each one was a small defeat. He didn't know why he'd offered to buy the diapers. He'd tried to analyze it afterward, standing at the register while the cashier, a teenager named Brandon according to his name tag, who very visibly did not recognize Elliot, scanned 6 packages of diapers plus the contents of Cara's basket, plus the sparkling water. The total came to $71 and some change. Elliot paid without looking at the screen. He'd tried to tell himself it was simply practicality. He'd seen a problem with an obvious solution and had applied the solution. That was how his mind worked, efficiently, without sentiment. But he knew that wasn't quite it, because there was sentiment involved, even if he couldn't locate exactly where it had come from. What he knew, standing there while Brandon stuffed diapers into oversized bags, was that he hadn't felt anything sharp or real in months. And watching Cara Mitchell put those coins away and look up at him with that complicated mix of pride and relief and suspicion, that had been sharp. That had been real. "You didn't have to add the pasta," Cara said beside him, not looking at him, watching the bags accumulate on the counter. "It was already in your basket." "I know, but you added the bread and the orange juice." He had, in fact, reached over while she was focused on Noah and added back the items he'd watched her quietly return to the shelves when she thought no one was paying attention. "I noticed you put them back," he said simply. She looked at him then. There was no gratitude in her expression yet. That would take longer. What was there was assessment. The careful, experienced look of someone who has learned that unexpected generosity usually comes attached to something. "What do you want?" she asked. He found that he appreciated the directness. Most people in his world were never direct. They circled and suggested and implied. "Nothing," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, testing the word for cracks. "That's not how it usually works," she said. "I know." He picked up 2 of the heavy bags before she could reach for them. "Can I help you to your car?" Her car was a 2009 Honda Civic with a cracked rear bumper and a parking permit hanging from the mirror. He noticed, without comment, that the back seat had a collection of items that told a story. A folded blanket, a spare bag of baby clothes, a library book on infant development with a cracked spine and dog-eared pages. The car of someone who lived with careful resourcefulness, where nothing was wasted and everything had a purpose. He loaded the bags into the trunk. Noah was awake now, sitting in his car seat and chewing thoughtfully on his own fist, observing Elliot with the unguarded curiosity that only babies and very old people seem to manage without self-consciousness. "He's looking at you," Cara said. Elliot looked back at the baby. Noah blinked, then produced a slow, enormous, entirely unprompted smile. The kind that takes over a baby's whole face, gums and all, completely without reservation. Elliot felt something move in his chest. Something he hadn't felt in so long, he'd half convinced himself it had atrophied permanently. "He does that to everyone," Cara said, but her voice had softened slightly. "Smart kid," Elliot said. Then, before he could stop himself, "Can I ask, is his father?" "Not in the picture," Cara said. Flat, clean, final. The kind of answer that closes a door firmly, but without drama. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It was my decision." She adjusted Noah's jacket collar and closed the back door. "Well, thank you, Elliot Hargrove. You didn't have to do any of that." "I know." She studied him for a moment. This tall, strange, oddly sincere man in an expensive suit who had appeared in a grocery store aisle and bought her baby's diapers and put back her orange juice without being asked. "Why were you even in that store?" she asked. "You don't exactly look like a Greenfields regular." Something shifted briefly behind his eyes, an honesty he hadn't planned on. "I needed to smell something normal," he said. She stared at him. Then, to his surprise, she laughed, a real one, fuller than the startled sound she'd made in the aisle. It changed her face completely. "That's the strangest thing anyone has ever said to me," she told him. "It's the strangest thing I've said in a while," he admitted. She opened her car door. Then she paused. "For what it's worth," she said, not quite looking at him, "it worked. You smell pretty normal." She got in. He stood in the parking lot and watched the Civic pull out, the cracked bumper catching the pale morning light, and he did something he couldn't remember doing in longer than he cared to admit. He stood still, and he didn't think about work. 3 days passed. Elliot went back to his 43rd floor and his structured days and his efficient, purposeful movements. Margaret noticed something different about him, a slight looseness in his posture, perhaps, or a reduced frequency of the particular tension he carried in his jaw, but she said nothing, because Margaret was excellent at saying nothing. He did not think about the woman in the beige sweater. Or so he told himself. He thought about her constantly. On Friday morning, he asked Margaret to find out who owned the 2009 Civic with license plate number. He had noticed it, filed it away without meaning to, the way his mind catalogued things automatically. And Margaret looked at him with her carefully neutral expression and said, "Is there something specific you're looking for, Mr. Hargrove?" And he said, "No, never mind." He was not a man who tracked strangers. That was not who he was, but he was also, and this was what he couldn't stop circling back to, not a man who bought strangers' groceries. Not a man who stood in parking lots thinking about nothing. Not a man who felt something move in his chest at a baby's smile. He had been that man once, before the company had grown so large that managing it became its own consuming universe. Before the divorce that had concluded 2 years ago with precise, amicable, devastating indifference, he and his ex-wife Dana sitting across a conference table from their respective lawyers, dividing assets with the same professional courtesy they'd brought to every decision in their 5-year marriage, right up until the moment they'd both quietly admitted that courtesy was all they'd ever really had. He had built an empire. He had lost, somewhere in the building of it, the ability to want anything simple. Until Tuesday morning in aisle 7, when a woman with coins in her hand had looked up at him without awe or calculation, just assessment, honest and clear, and something in him had woken up like a door opening into a room that had been closed for years. On Friday afternoon, without telling Margaret, Elliot Hargrove put on his coat and walked back to Greenfield's grocery on Wicker Park. He didn't know if she would be there. He had no reasonable expectation that she would be. He told himself he was simply going for a walk. He walked straight to aisle 7. She wasn't there. He stood for a moment in front of the diaper shelf, fully stocked now, all 6 size 2 options restored, and felt something drop slightly in his chest. Then he heard, from the direction of the produce section, a baby laugh. It was the kind of laugh that carries, unself-conscious, pure, the acoustic opposite of everything serious. He turned. Cara was standing by the apples, holding Noah up so he could bat at a bunch of bananas hanging from a hook, and Noah was absolutely delighted by this, producing that enormous full-face laugh again. And Cara was smiling in a way that made her look entirely different from the woman who had counted coins 3 days ago. Lighter, more herself. Elliot stood at the end of the aisle and watched for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Then Noah spotted him across the store, those dark, unguarded eyes landing on Elliot's face, and laughed even harder, as if greeting an old friend. Cara turned to see what her son was laughing at. Her expression when she saw Elliot was impossible to read, and then her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Something in her face changed, the lightness gone instantly, replaced by something tight and braced. She answered it, and Elliot watched her listen for 3 seconds before the color shifted in her face. He couldn't hear the words, but he could see, clearly and without question, that whatever was on the other end of that call was about to change everything. The call lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Cara knew because she watched the timer on her screen climb, the way you watch something you can't stop, waiting for it to be over. It was her landlord, not the building management company, not an automated reminder. Gerald Fitch himself, 63 years old, owner of 4 rental properties in Wicker Park, and a disposition that had soured steadily over the 22 years he'd been in the business. He was calling to inform her, in the measured tone of someone who had made this particular call many times before, that her rent payment had failed to process. She knew that. She had known it was coming since Wednesday. The auto payment had bounced because the $12 in her account had dipped to $9 after a pharmacy charge she'd forgotten about, Noah's reflux medication, $11.40, and $9 did not constitute $840, not by any honest accounting. What she had not known was what Gerald Fitch said next. "Cara, I've been patient with you. You know that. But I've got a waiting list for that unit. And I've got a family. Good references first and last, ready to move in the first of the month." A pause, deliberate, waited. "I'm going to need you to be out by the 30th. The 30th was 13 days away. She kept her voice steady. That was the one thing she had always been good at, keeping her voice steady while everything else shook. She thanked Gerald Fitch, which was absurd but automatic, and ended the call. She stood by the Apple display and looked at the bananas Noah had been batting at 30 seconds ago, before the world had rearranged itself, and she breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth the way the therapist she could no longer afford had taught her, and she did not cry because Noah was watching her with wide, attentive eyes, and babies, even at 8 months, know when something is wrong. "Hey, buddy," she said softly, adjusting him against her hip. "We're okay." She wasn't sure that was true, but she said it anyway, the way you say things to babies, not because they understand the words, but because the steadiness of your voice is itself a kind of promise. "Cara." She turned. Elliot Hargrove was standing 6 feet away, and his expression had shifted from whatever had been on it when she spotted him, something tentative, almost uncertain, which had seemed entirely inconsistent with the kind of man he appeared to be, to something more direct, attentive. The same quality of focus he'd had in the diaper aisle, like someone who had trained themselves to see past the surface of things. "I wasn't trying to overhear," he said, "but I could see your face." "I'm fine," she said. He looked at her with the quiet patience of someone who had heard that particular sentence too many times to find it convincing. "Okay," he said, and didn't push. That was the thing that undid her slightly, right there between the apples and the oranges. He didn't push, he just stood there, giving her the space to be however she needed to be, without filling it with reassurances or questions, or the particular discomfort that most people felt in the presence of someone else's difficulty, the discomfort that made them talk too much. She shifted Noah to her other hip, swallowed. "My landlord just told me I have 13 days to find somewhere else to live," she said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out the way things do when you've been holding them alone for too long. Elliot's expression didn't flicker into pity, which she had been bracing for. It stayed level, thinking. "Do you have family in the city?" he asked. "My mother is in Cincinnati. She paused. "It's complicated. Friends you could stay with?" "For a night or two, maybe. Not 13 days, not with a baby." She looked at Noah, who had found a strand of her hair and was examining it with tremendous seriousness. "I've been looking at short-term rentals for 2 weeks, everything in a reasonable distance from Noah's pediatrician, and my job is either $2,000 a month or requires a credit check I'd fail right now, or both." Elliot nodded slowly. "What do you do?" he asked. "For work?" "I'm a line cook at Hadley's on Darman, 4 shifts a week since my hours were cut. I was a sous chef at a restaurant downtown before—" She stopped. "Before Noah." Before Ryan had disappeared at 23 weeks of pregnancy, with a text message and a Venmo request for half the security deposit on the apartment they'd shared. She didn't say any of that. Before things changed, something moved across his face. Recognition, maybe, or respect. "You're a chef," he said. "Line cook," she corrected. At the moment. He was quiet for a moment, thinking again. She could see it. The way something worked behind his eyes that wasn't calculation exactly, but was close to it. Purposeful, building towards something. "I have a proposition," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I'm going to stop you there." "It's not—" He almost smiled, the first time she'd seen anything close to it on his face. "It's not what you're thinking. You don't know what I'm thinking. You're thinking I'm about to offer you something that obligates you to me in a way you're not comfortable with." She held his gaze. "Are you?" "No," he said. And then, after a beat, "I have a guest house." The produce section hummed quietly around them. A woman chose between two heads of lettuce nearby. A child complained about something in the next aisle. "A guest house," Cara repeated. "On my property in Lincoln Park. Say it's been empty for 8 months. It has 2 bedrooms, a full kitchen, and it's approximately 12 minutes from Wicker Park if traffic is reasonable." He said this in the same tone he might use to describe a quarterly report. Factual, measured. "I'm not there often. The main house runs on a skeleton staff, a housekeeper twice a week, a groundskeeper. You'd essentially be on your own." "Why is it empty?" she asked. A brief pause. The first one she'd noticed that seemed to cost him something. "It was my ex-wife's space," he said. "She used it as a studio. She painted." He looked at a point somewhere past Cara's shoulder. "She's been gone 2 years. I haven't found a reason to do anything with it." Cara studied him. The expensive suit, the careful face, the watch that cost more than she'd earned in the past year, and underneath it, something she hadn't expected. Something genuinely lonely. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the deeper kind. The loneliness of being surrounded by everything you built and realizing it doesn't keep you warm. "I can't afford whatever you'd charge," she said. "I'm not charging anything," he said. "Elliot—" "You'd be doing me a favor," he said. And something in the evenness of his voice made it clear he meant it. "That space has been closed for 2 years. There's something wrong about that." She opened her mouth, closed it. She thought about Gerald Fitch and 13 days, and the short-term rental listings on her phone, the ones she'd been scrolling through at 2 in the morning while Noah slept, and the anxiety sat on her chest like a stone. She thought about what it meant to accept this, what it meant about her, what it might cost her, not financially, but in the quieter currency of self-sufficiency that she had spent 8 months protecting with everything she had. "I'd need to pay you something," she said finally, "even if it's small." He considered that, nodded. "Cook dinner," he said. "Once a week, whatever you want. That's the rent." She stared at him. "That's not a fair trade." "It is to me," he said. "I haven't had a home-cooked meal in—" He stopped, seemed to calculate. "I genuinely can't remember." Noah, who had been patient through this entire adult conversation, chose this moment to reach out and grab Elliot's jacket lapel with one decisive fist, pulling himself toward the tall stranger with the confidence of someone who has never once considered that the world might not welcome him. Elliot went very still, not with discomfort, but with the careful stillness of someone who didn't want to startle something fragile. Noah looked up at him, smiled his enormous, full face, unreserved smile. Elliot looked back at him, and whatever carefully maintained distance he'd been holding in his expression simply wasn't there anymore. "Once a week," Cara said quietly, "and I start looking for a permanent place immediately. This isn't permanent." "Understood," he said. "And if it gets weird, you leave. No questions, no obligation." She exhaled, a long, slow breath that felt like putting down something very heavy. "Okay," she said, for the second time, the same word, the same man, the same aisle, or close enough. What neither of them understood yet. What would only become clear much later, in the particular way that important things often reveal themselves gradually, like a photograph developing in a darkroom, was that the arrangement they were making in the produce section of Greenfield's grocery was not really about a guest house or a weekly dinner. It was about two people who had each, in their own way, stopped believing that ordinary moments could hold anything worth keeping. They were both, in that regard, about to be proven spectacularly wrong. But first, something was going to have to break. 3 days after Cara and Noah moved into the guest house on Elliot's Lincoln Park property, 3 days of careful distance, polite text messages about arrival times and where spare keys were kept, of Cara navigating the beautiful, overwhelmingly quiet space and trying not to feel like an imposter in it. Elliot came home early from a board meeting to find something he had not been told about. There was a man sitting in his driveway. Not a stranger. Worse than that. A man Elliot recognized immediately, mid-30s, sandy-haired, the particular look of someone who had once been careless with his attractiveness and was only now beginning to understand that carelessness has a cost. He was sitting on the hood of a car Elliot didn't recognize, and he was looking at the guest house with an expression that mixed guilt and calculation in a ratio that Elliot found instantly, viscerally wrong. Elliot pulled in, got out of his car. The man looked at him, then at the guest house, then back at Elliot, and something shifted in his expression. A reassessment, the social math of encountering someone unexpectedly powerful in a situation you thought you controlled. "I'm looking for Cara Mitchell," the man said. "And you are?" Elliot asked. The man squared his shoulders, the gesture of someone performing a confidence they didn't entirely feel. "Ryan," he said. "Ryan Calloway. I'm Noah's father." The word father landed in the driveway like something dropped from a great height. Elliot stood very still. He had a particular gift for stillness. It was one of the things that had made him formidable in boardrooms for 15 years, the ability to receive unexpected information without letting it move across his face. He used it now, looking at Ryan Calloway, taking in the details the way he took in everything, quickly, completely, without revealing that he was doing it. Ryan was wearing a jacket that had been expensive once, and now showed the particular wear of someone who had stopped paying attention to the details of his own life. He had a good face, the kind that photographed well, symmetrical and easy, but there was something unfinished about him up close, like a building with a beautiful facade and nothing behind it. He held Elliot's gaze for approximately 4 seconds before looking away. That told Elliot almost everything he needed to know. "She's not here right now," Elliot said. His voice was even, unrevealing. Ryan's eyes moved to the guest house again. "She living here?" "That's not something I'm going to discuss with you." Ryan refocused on him. Something defensive gathered in his expression, the look of a man who was accustomed to a particular kind of social authority and was recalibrating in the presence of someone who didn't recognize it. "Look, I don't know who you are," Ryan said, "but Cara is the mother of my son. I have every right—" "What you have," Elliot said, with a quiet precision that wasn't aggressive but was absolute, "is a conversation to have with her, not with me, and not in my driveway without her knowledge." A silence stretched between them. A crow called somewhere in the oak trees lining the property. Traffic moved distantly on Fullerton Avenue. Ryan looked at the house one more time. Then he pulled out his phone, typed something, slid it back into his pocket. "Tell her I was here," he said. "She'll know," Elliot said. Ryan got in his car. Elliot stood in the driveway and watched him leave, and did not move until the car had turned the corner and disappeared entirely. Then he took out his own phone and sent Cara a message. 3 words: "We need to talk." She came back 40 minutes later with Noah asleep in the carrier against her chest, her cheeks pink from the cold, a canvas bag of groceries on her arm. She had been at the farmer's market on Green Street, she said. They let vendors sell discounted produce in the last hour before close, and she had learned every discount rhythm in a 6-block radius. She read Ryan's message. He had texted her directly. She showed Elliot without being asked, and something happened to her face that was not quite any single emotion, but a composite of several: anger, exhaustion, a complicated sorrow, and underneath it all the braced expression of someone who has seen this particular thing coming from a distance, and still finds it hits hard when it arrives. They sat in the kitchen of the main house, the first time she'd been inside it beyond the front hallway, because Elliot had asked and she had, after a moment, said yes. It was a large kitchen, all clean lines and warm wood, with a window that looked out onto the back garden, where the November bare branches of an old oak tree made precise patterns against the grey sky. He made coffee without asking if she wanted it. She sat at the counter and watched him move around the kitchen with the focused inefficiency of someone who didn't do it often enough to be graceful at it, and something about that, his expensive suit, his serious face, the way he held the coffee bag slightly too far from the machine, made her feel unexpectedly less like a guest. "He left when I was 23 weeks pregnant," she said. She hadn't planned to start there, but that was where the story started, and she was tired of carrying it alone. "We'd been together 2 years. I don't know what I thought we were building something." She wrapped both hands around the mug Elliot set in front of her. He sent a text, said he wasn't ready, that he was sorry, that he'd be in touch. She looked at the steam rising from the coffee. "That was 8 months ago. Noah is 8 months old. You can do the math." Elliot sat across from her. He didn't say "I'm sorry," which she appreciated because she was tired of that particular phrase, however kindly meant. "What does he want now?" Elliot asked. "I don't know yet." She looked at Ryan's text on her phone, sitting face up on the counter between them. "Cara, I need to see you. I've changed. Please." 3 sentences that had undone 8 months in approximately 4 seconds. "He does this. He disappears and then he surfaces, and he always has a reason. He needed time. He needed to figure things out. He was scared." She paused. "And the worst part is that every reason is probably true. He's not a bad person. He's just not ready," Elliot said. "He's never ready," she said. "And I spent 2 years adjusting my life to fit around his not being ready, and I can't—" Her voice stayed steady, but something tightened in it. "I can't do that anymore. I have Noah. Noah is not adjustable." Elliot was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the oak tree moved slightly in the wind. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I'm going to meet him," she said, "and I'm going to listen to what he has to say, because he's Noah's father, and that's not nothing. Whatever else is true." She looked up at Elliot. "And then I'm going to make a decision based on what's best for Noah, not what's easiest, not what Ryan wants. What is actually best for my son." Elliot looked at her across the kitchen counter, looked at her for long enough that she became aware of it, the particular quality of his attention, the way it wasn't the performed attentiveness of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but something more genuine and more still. "You know," he said slowly, "I have sat across conference tables from senators, from CEOs, from people whose decisions affect millions of people, and I have very rarely heard someone say something that clearly and that simply." She blinked. "I'm just talking about my kid." "I know," he said. "That's why it's clear." She met Ryan the following afternoon at a coffee shop on Armitage Avenue. She brought Noah because Noah was not someone she arranged around other people's convenience any longer. Ryan was already there when she arrived. He stood up when he saw her, a gesture that might have been courtesy, or might have been the particular anxiety of someone who has been rehearsing. He looked at Noah with an expression that Cara watched carefully, the way a scientist watches a reaction, measuring what was genuine and what was performed. What she saw was genuine. That was the complicated part. Ryan's eyes went to Noah, and something in them broke open. Not dramatically, not with tears, but with a quietness that she recognized as real because she had never seen Ryan be quiet before in his life. He was by nature loud and certain and forward-moving. That stillness was new. "Hi," he said to Noah. Just that. Just hi, in a voice barely above a whisper. Noah stared at him with the serious assessment of an 8-month-old confronting something unfamiliar. Then, after a moment that lasted much longer than it should have, he reached out one hand toward Ryan's face. Cara sat down. She ordered a tea she didn't really want, and she listened. Ryan talked for almost an hour. He had, he said, spent 3 months with a therapist after leaving. He named the therapist, gave details, the kind of specifics that were hard to fabricate. He had moved back to Chicago from Portland in September. He had a job now, a real one, managing a sporting goods warehouse, not glamorous but stable. He had been working up the courage to call her since October, and every time he had failed, and then he had heard from a mutual friend that she'd moved and he'd panicked and driven to find her, which he understood had been the wrong move and he was sorry. He said he didn't expect anything. He wasn't asking to come back into her life in any way she wasn't comfortable with, but he would like, if she would let him, to be in Noah's. Cara looked at him across the table. She thought about the text at 23 weeks. She thought about the 9 months alone, the pregnancy, the delivery, the first night home from the hospital, when she had sat in the dark with her newborn son and felt a terror so complete it was almost calm. She thought about the coins in her palm in aisle 7. She thought about what she had told Elliot the previous evening. What is actually best for my son? "I'm not ready to trust you," she said. "And I need you to understand that's not a door. It's a starting point. You don't get to walk back into Noah's life like a door you just push open. You have to build that." Ryan nodded. Something in him was very careful. The way a person is careful when they know they are being given something they haven't earned and might not deserve. "I know," he said. "Supervised. To start. My terms, my timeline. And if you disappear again—" She paused. "If you disappear again, we're done. Not me and you, we've been done. I mean you and him. I won't do that to him twice." "I understand," Ryan said, and he meant it. She could see him meaning it, which was its own complicated feeling, because it would have been easier if he didn't. She drove home in the early afternoon with Noah asleep in the car seat and a feeling she hadn't expected sitting in her chest. Not relief exactly, not anger. Something more like clarity. The particular clearness that comes after a long time of not being able to see the shape of things. She had not forgiven Ryan. She was not sure she ever fully would. But forgiveness, she was beginning to understand, was not the same as wisdom. Wisdom was knowing what her son needed. Forgiveness could take its time. 6 weeks later, Cara found her apartment. It was a 2-bedroom on the 2nd floor of a building in Logan Square, smaller than the Lincoln Park guest house, with radiator heat that clanged every morning at 6 and a view of a parking lot. But it was hers, and the landlord was a retired schoolteacher named Doris, who had taken one look at Noah and told Cara she could move in the first of the month with 2 weeks' deposit instead of 3. She told Elliot on a Wednesday evening, over the dinner she cooked in his kitchen. A braised chicken with herbs from the small pot she'd been growing on the guest house windowsill, with roasted root vegetables and a crusty bread she'd made from scratch. He had started arriving home earlier on Wednesday evenings, she'd noticed. Not dramatically, just slightly, the way someone rearranges their routine around something they don't want to name yet. He was quiet for a moment after she told him, set down his fork, looked at the table. "That's good," he said. "It is," she said. A pause stretched between them, the kind that has weight to it. "I've been thinking about something," he said. He looked up at her with the directness she had come to associate with him, the way he said things without preamble, as if he had already done all the circling privately and arrived at the center by the time he spoke. "The restaurant you used to work at before—" "Meridian," she said. "Downtown, I was sous chef." "I know, I looked it up." He said it without apology. "The head chef position has been open for 4 months. I looked into that too." She stared at him. "Elliot, I know someone on their board," he said. "I'm not offering to hand you anything. Your record speaks for itself. I read 2 reviews that mentioned you by name before you left. What I'm offering is a conversation, an introduction. What you do with it is entirely yours." She looked at him across the table, at this man who had appeared in her life with a bottle of sparkling water and no plan, who had asked for nothing, who had given her space and coffee and a kitchen and the very particular gift of being seen without being pitied, who had stood in his own driveway and looked at Ryan Calloway with a quiet, absolute protectiveness that he had never once named or claimed. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Not the way she'd asked it in the grocery store, guarded and suspicious. A different question now, a genuine one. He was quiet for a moment, honest in the way he was honest, without performance. "Because 6 weeks ago I was a man who couldn't remember the last time he ate a meal someone cooked for him," he said. And now every Wednesday I come home, and there is food on the table and a baby who laughs at me like I'm the funniest thing he's ever seen, and—" He stopped. Something moved in his face. "And I would like very much not to go back to the way things were before Tuesday morning in aisle 7. Cara looked at him for a long time. "I'm not a project," she said quietly. "No," he said. "You're the person who makes everything else feel worth doing." Outside, through the kitchen window, the oak tree stood bare and dark against the evening sky, the same tree she had looked at on her first night in the guest house, when she had put Noah down and sat alone in the silence, and wondered how much longer she could hold everything together by herself. She hadn't known then that holding everything together by yourself wasn't the same as being strong. She knew it now. "The conversation," she said, "with your contact at Meridian." His eyes lifted, careful, hopeful in the restrained way of someone who has learned to be careful with hope. "I'll take it," she said. He nodded. And then, slowly, with the particular uncertainty of a man who has been precise and controlled and sufficient unto himself for so long that ordinary vulnerability has become foreign, he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. She turned her hand over and held it. Noah, in the baby seat beside the table, looked between them with his wide, dark eyes. And then he produced his smile. That full face, unreserved, completely unjaded smile that had started everything, back in a grocery store aisle on a grey Chicago morning when a woman counted coins and a man who had everything needed something real. He smiled as if he had known all along how this would go. Maybe he had. 3 months later, Cara stood in the kitchen of Meridian on a Friday evening, calling out orders in a clear voice, every station moving with the particular choreography of a well-run service, the smell of braised short rib and fresh herb oil and wood smoke filling the air. Her whites were pressed. Her knife roll was on the shelf above her station. Her name was on the schedule as head chef. She had earned it. And somewhere across the city, in a Lincoln Park house with a light on in the kitchen, a man who had once walked into an ordinary grocery store, looking for something he couldn't name, sat on the floor with an 11-month-old boy, building a tower of soft blocks and knocking it down, and building it again, laughing each time it fell. Some things, it turns out, you don't find when you go looking. You find them on a Tuesday morning in aisle 7, between the diapers and the orange juice, when you finally stop moving long enough to see what's right in front of you.